Wonderful. Well, hello everyone. Good morning. Hope you're all keeping well wherever you are. Glad to hear that it is indeed International Dog Day. It's a nice bit of joy for these times that we're going through at the moment. For the next 2 hours or so, we're going to be workshopping with NVivo. So hopefully you've all managed to install NVivo in advance, and we're going to be doing I guess like a farm to table kind of thing with a research project today. I've got a link to some files that you can download, and I'll paste that link in the chat later on. It's just on Dropbox and shouldn't be too tricky to download. I might actually paste that link. I might just quickly stop this slide deck, move over to where the links are and paste it right now so that you can all download them in the background while I do any introductory spiel stuff. So there's a link to the Dropbox. Let me know if it doesn't work, and that's going to have a bunch of interviews in them that we'll be using for our analysis today. Now, it's not to say that you can't use your own files for your own research projects if you've got them lying around. It's just that's what we're going to be working with today, and I'll talk about why we're going to be working with those specific files in a bit as well. If my internet does get a little bit weird or cuts out at various points, please do let me know. It has again been temperamental these past few weeks, and my partner's placement, she's a physiotherapist. She was over at the Austin doing a placement. She's now had to come and work from home, so there's now 2 people using our internet during these times. So we'll see how we all go. There's a lot of learning outcomes today, and you know, this is kind of a general flow of how a lot of projects in NVivo are going to be working. So the first thing that we're going to do, and I've kind of separated these into different parts as well, but what we want to do is we want to create a project all on our own in NVivo and then start working through it, importing our interviews, and then subjecting them to 2 types of different coding for cases and for codes, creating a classification, just like a spreadsheet that keeps track of all of the information about our interview participants, their age, occupation, stuff related to the research question. And once we've done all that work, then we're going to have a look at queries, and we're going to try running a framework matrix query, which is very, very useful. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll have a look at creating a bar chart as well, just so that we have a pretty good understanding of a whole range of different features in NVivo. Now, usually I have 4 weeks and 4-hour-long sessions to kind of go over this content. I've never really done a 2-hour Zoom training session before. There will be a 5-minute break in the middle because I'll need to grab some water, and I'll need to have a stretch and stuff like that. So I have kind of set a rough part of the class where I think that will be. I'm just going to quickly grab my phone over here so that I have a quick reminder for it. But if it kind of gets to halfway, and we'll have a little break there and then come back after that break and see how we're all going. If at any point you want to ask any questions at all, you can leave them in the chat and I'll try to get to them as we go. One of the benefits of the way the class is going to work today is I'm going to kind of maybe introduce a concept, show you how to do it in NVivo, and then give you about 5 or 10 minutes to do it yourself in NVivo as well. Some won't go for that long, some will be a lot shorter. But during that time when you're often doing things in NVivo, it's a great opportunity to also ask me questions and to work through any concerns you might have. I'm on the Windows version of NVivo today, not the Mac version. If you are on the Mac version, I'm generally pretty good at remembering where all of the different functions are, and I've made a determined effort to try to only include elements of NVivo that look similar enough in today's class, but we will find, especially in the first few bits, that there are things that are going to look a lot different. And in those cases, you may want to, as a way of troubleshooting, share your screen with me so I can kind of direct you around, or hopefully I'm able to direct you around just with the power of my own experience on the Mac version and my imagination, and yours as well. So let's get stuck into it. There, you might recall from the showcase that we had a look at 3 key functions in NVivo. The first was being able to import a wide range of different files. So whilst we're only going to be working with Word documents today with interview transcripts, you can import survey results from SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics. You can import reference libraries from Zotero and EndNote. And I will talk a little bit about doing literature reviews in NVivo as we go today as well, because I know that was something that someone brought up during the training or during the showcase last week that I didn't have as much time to get to. So I'll try to kind of weave that in the demonstrations, because there are a few things that are a little bit different as we go through. The second key function is organizing, and that's where we're going to be creating our codes and our cases. And don't worry too much about this terminology. I do have glossaries that will introduce the terms as we go through them. And then at the end, we're going to have a look at that final function, which is exploring our project through queries and visualizations. And queries, very, very useful. What I'm hoping is that the work that we do for the most of the session today will get us to a point where we're able to work well with queries. If not, I hope you still find them a useful thing to know about. But they are these last few exploration functions only really work well if you've done a lot of work in NVivo leading up to it. And so I hope that the workflow today kind of gets us to that point. But if it doesn't, then hopefully you can still see the merit in using them. So what we're doing and why I've sent you a link to download those interviews is my kind of end goal for today is, because I might not be coming back, or if I do, it might be in a different capacity or whatever. You may never see me again. I want you to be confident being able to use NVivo's own sample project. And that's what I was showing off last week. It's what I was working with. And I find it a little bit intimidating. It is a real research project, although the survey data in that project is fabricated. And it was conducted between, I think, 3 principal researchers between 2008 and 2009. And it's got a lot of interviews alongside the surveys. And the general focus of the research is on different perceptions of development and land use change in this down east region of North Carolina in the United States. It is intimidating to use. First off, when I started using NVivo, I didn't really know how to navigate it. A lot of things are hidden away. And if you don't know what the functions do in NVivo, then you don't really know what to get out of the sample project. So what I'm hoping that we can do today is, if you're not using your own data and you use the data that I've sent through that link there, hoping that we'll be able to build up our understanding of NVivo using the same data that the sample project uses, so that once we've been able to work with that and to understand how it works and how it slots into NVivo's user interface, that you can then come out of this session confident to use the sample project as kind of a reference project for your own work in NVivo. The kind of end goal of what we want to do today is we want to put in our interviews, we want to code them, and what we then want to do is see if we can see any difference in some of what we've coded based on demographic attributes of our interview participants. Doesn't matter how long they've been in the region and so on and so forth. Now, that is going to be a little bit tricky because we don't have the demographic attributes of the interview participants readily available to us. We're going to have to create them on our own. And so we're not going to necessarily, well, we're definitely not going to have a rigorous research project, but we are going to be able to put in the right amounts of data to answer questions as if we did have accurate ways of describing our participants and working with our research data. So without further ado, we'll get into the first section of our workshop today, and hopefully you will have NVivo installed and you can open it now as well if you would like. The 3 things we're going to be looking at in the importing part of the workshop are creating a project from the ground up, understanding how the user interface in NVivo works, and then importing some files into NVivo as well. Now, I'm very quickly seeing that in the chat there, a few people might be on NVivo 12. That's okay. It does look a little bit different, but some things are in similar areas. There are some terminological differences as well. So here's our kind of glossary terms for what we're going to be working with in this section. So when I refer to a project in NVivo, what I'm referring to is a real file on your device that is created whenever you click the Create Project button in NVivo. It contains all of your data, and it is a proprietary file format, which is on the Windows version .nvp and on the Mac version .nvpx. And you can copy and paste that file around, but you can only ever read that file in NVivo. It takes a little bit of wizardry and using some other technical functions to be able to, like I was mentioning last week, export that project as a .qdpx file type, which can be read by a whole bunch of other qualitative data analysis software. Now, there's two kind of areas in NVivo that we're going to be focusing on in this part. And then there's some other areas that I haven't included in this glossary, which will hopefully become apparent as we go. But you've got what's known as the project navigation. I'll refer to that a lot. That's on the left-hand side of your user interface. And then at the top, we've got our project functions. When I refer to a file in NVivo, it's any data that you want to import. So it could be a survey, that could be a file. Each interview is a file. A PDF would be a file as well. In some instances, particularly when you're working with importing reference libraries, each reference might be its own individual file, not just the library itself. NVivo works with them all in slightly different ways. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to move my screen over into NVivo. And before I do that, I'm going to triple check that I've got to reopen my NVivo again. It's done this like nasty habit of whenever I train, I close all of my software on my device and then realize that I always need to have NVivo open in advance. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions here. Glad that people have the licensing and things available to them. For Chris's question, you don't need to open the sample project. What we're going to be working with today is creating our own project from scratch. So that's what I'm going to quickly demonstrate now. But if you don't have access to those interviews, which I've linked to in the chat, then you can use the sample project. But like I mentioned, I do find it a little bit intimidating to work with. So today, what we want to work with is a new project. So here's my version of NVivo on the Mac. It's going to look different already, but the main area we want to focus on for the purposes of this first demonstration is this new project button at the top here. Now you can see we've also got access to a few sample projects. Like I mentioned, I do find them a little intimidating to get started with. And because they've kind of already done a lot of the work, you don't necessarily learn the skills that you need to learn in NVivo because they've already done that in advance. So we want to be focusing on learning the skills today and not necessarily looking at what a finished project looks like. So I'm going to click on New Project here. And immediately on the Mac version, you'll get something a little bit different. The Mac version has a much larger initial screen, which allows you to change a few functions. We're going to give this project a little title. I can just simply name it the 26th of August training. You can see that it's going to be saved on your computer in a default kind of area. You can choose where you save it, and I'd recommend having a look. I like to always have mine uploaded to OneDrive, although with the caveat that if I ever have a Zoom meeting afterwards, my computer's internet tanks when I'm trying to have a meeting because it's uploading this file to the cloud. You'll see there's a lot in NVivo, which is the ability to give something a description. Now, I'm not going to be filling this in just because we're probably going to end up being short on time today. But at every point in your own research project, I would really strongly recommend filling in these description sections so that you have a key way of telling other researchers about the decisions that you made and providing contextual information about your research project. When you finish a project, what'll happen is you'll probably upload it to a repository somewhere, and you may never view it again, but lots of other people might. And if they are viewing it, you want to make sure that they are able to understand all of the decisions that you made, and all of the kind of key ways of understanding and engaging with the research project. So do, whenever you see a description, fill something in. It's a really nice way to clarify your own thinking, but it's also great for research integrity. We've got this option down here to keep a log of user actions. I always recommend keeping this ticked, and then we can select what language our data files are going to be in. So this is a quick limitation of NVivo. You can see that there's only 8 languages represented here, and 2 of them are English. If you're working with languages that are not necessarily represented here, or if you're working with bilingual projects, you might run into some issues with some of NVivo's automated functions later down the line. One of the big problems that I've run into are people who work with Arabic scripts and certain scripts that are read right to left. NVivo really struggles to not only recognize those characters, but it also struggles to format the data appropriately as well. So if you're working with that data, there are a few workarounds. The one thing that I think it needs to do a lot better on it is particularly this area, because 8 languages is pretty limited. And so if you are one of those researchers who are working with those projects, you can have a chat with me after the class and we can see if we can work out something of a solution there. But I know that the data we're using today is in United States English because it was conducted in North Carolina. So I can select that and click on the next button. And this is where we get to a few saving features, which are really important to know about. It may seem really alluring to toggle on autosave. It's a feature that most other pieces of software have, but for some reason in NVivo, if you toggle on autosave on the Windows version, it will disable the undo button, which is a nightmare. It's not what you want to happen, because if you ever make a mistake, you have to go the long way to undo that mistake instead of simply clicking the undo button. So by default, I like to have it turned off. Now on the Mac version, it's got a little bit of a different autosave. It autosaves every few minutes. And because it autosaves at intervals, it's a lot easier to be able to press the undo button. Whereas with the Windows version, it autosaves after every decision that you make. So instead of that, what we have are these very janky little save reminders. They'll be annoying, but I always recommend having them turned on because you don't want to close your project without saving it. And then finally down here, we've got project recovery. And this is going to be really important as well. NVivo is a piece of software. It can mess up, it can bug out. And if it does, then you need to make sure you have a backup, because NVivo is quite a comprehensive piece of software. It's meant to be the one-stop shop for a lot of qualitative data research and mixed methods research. You really need to make sure you've got backups of your files. Now, project recoveries are pretty useful if you're working on like an honors thesis or a year-long project. I'd recommend having 1 recovery file. If it's anything longer than that, I'd recommend having 2 or 3. And in both cases, I would recommend copying your project at regular intervals onto a repository or a backup somewhere as well. So by default, mine are saved onto OneDrive. I would really recommend also copying it off of that and saving it locally on your own device or on a portable hard drive once a month, just so if anything goes wrong, you're not one of those researcher horror stories where you lose your whole project. So those are just nice things to get into right at the start. Once we've selected those parameters, and not all of them are available on the Mac version, we can select Create Project here, and it is going to open up a nice instance of NVivo for us. And this is what our project is going to look like. Now, whenever you open up something on NVivo, you can get a tour. I again would really recommend going through this tour in your own time. For now, because you've got me here as your guide, you can click Skip Tour in the top right. I would always recommend making sure that it's available. One of the things you might run into with research is you might start a project in NVivo, or you might learn NVivo before you've done your data collection, and that could take months. And so when you come back to NVivo, you might be a little bit rusty. It's always nice to have this tour readily available, but we're going to skip it for today. So just like in the glossary, on the left-hand side here, we've got our project navigation. And on the top here, we've got all of our functions. Now, on the Windows version, it'll tell you where you are in the top left here, and you will need to have a look and see which area is slightly grayed out to indicate that that is where you are on the Mac version. It is a bit of a pain. One of the problems with the latest version of NVivo is this contrast and user interface stuff that they've been working on. I don't find it great in terms of understanding how things are working. Just to kind of do a little bit of a case in point as well, at the top here with our functions, you'll see, or you might not, that some are grayed out, whereas others aren't. And it's very difficult to tell the difference between them. The only option you really have is to see that the functions that are enabled will gray out if you hover over them. But again, even that is of a pretty low contrast. Bit of a shame. Previous versions of NVivo, particularly NVivo 12 on the Windows version, I think had a much better and cleaner system of contrast. There are a few decisions, and I'll probably talk about them as we go through, that kind of irk me a lot with this latest version. But for now, we just want to keep paying attention on the left-hand side here to navigation. So we're currently by default in the files area, and we can sort of have a look at other areas in this blank project that we have created. Importantly, just as a kind of key thing to think about, today we're going to be moving from top to bottom. So we start with importing our files, we work with organizing them into codes and cases, and then we finish off with queries and visualizations. That's the workflow for today. If I click on any of these other areas, what you'll see is not only will this change at the top here, but this is actually quite a nice feature of NVivo. Whenever I move to a different area in my project, if it's blank or even if it's not sometimes, you will get a nice little description that introduces you to whatever area of the project you are in. So you can see if I go down to codes, I will get, after a little bit of loading, a nice description of what my codes will be doing and all of these things as well. At the top here, with navigation aside, what we have all of our little functions, and you might think this is very similar to something like Microsoft Word. You can see we've got the import tab, and here's my second pet peeve of the latest version of NVivo. It's the sheer amount of white space at the top here, because what they've done is they've crammed all of their functions into a lot of drop-down menus, which is, I suppose, fine, but very tricky if you're looking for something specific, because it's not always obvious how it's going to work. In particular, what I'd really like is there's no easy way of knowing what type of file your spreadsheet is going to be in NVivo. And what I mean by that is that, it could be a survey, but it could be just like a bunch of the demographic information about your participants, and they actually end up in two different places. And I'd really like just a second button here for spreadsheets, and you can then use that to put them in the right place. I've put the feedback in. Hopefully they update it to have that, but I'm not super hopeful, but it's just another pet peeve of mine. But we can move through all of these different tabs at the top here and again see the sort of white space issues. For those of you who are working on the Mac version and whose supervisors are working on different versions, this export project button at the top here is going to be very useful, because that's what's going to allow you to change the file format of your project from .nvp, which is the Windows one, to .nvpx, which is the Mac one, or to .qdpx, which is the one that can be read by lots of other data analysis software. Just important to know about. We don't really cover it today, but it's good to know that that's where that feature is stashed away, because I know it's a very popular one between different groups of researchers. So for our kind of purposes today, there's going to be two things that we're going to have a look at. The first is just introducing the most useful feature in NVivo, in my opinion, which is the humble right click. Now, I'm going to be importing some files, and then I'm going to leave you to import some files in a little bit. But I just want you to keep in mind that I'm going to create a folder for those files. And in doing so, I'm going to be doing it on the left-hand side navigation panel here. The easiest way to do any of this stuff is to kind of hover over the thing that you want to do something with. It might be a file. It might be this kind of general files section. It might be your codes. It might even be some data. You just select it, you right click, and NVivo will bring up all of the possible options that you can use with it. And so we can even use it to import our files as well. So I'm going to create a new folder. And again, you'll see the same kind of design here. We've got name and description. I'm going to simply call this interviews, and you can pop in a description if you'd like. Again, in your own research projects, very, very important to do this, especially if you're sharing your research projects with collaborators. So I'm going to click OK, and NVivo is pretty inconsistent when it comes to some stuff. It will not always immediately open the thing that you create. So sometimes when you create something in NVivo, it will automatically open that up and you can work with it. But we can see, because our file section here is still colored in, that we haven't moved into the interview section just yet. So we can left click there to move into our interviews. And it's always good to be aware of this, because interviews, our folder, is a subtype of our files here. So because of that, it gives us the introduction to files, which can be very confusing because we're in a different area to just the general files area. So on the Windows version, we want to pay attention at the top left here. And on the Mac version, you need to make do with the contrast options that are available to you. So I've opened up my interviews folder. I'm going to click close down here and just get rid of that kind of tutorial thing. What I now want to do, now that we're kind of familiar with how to kind of move through and work with the navigation panel, I want to import some files. And to do that, I'm going to go to the import tab at the top here and left click on this files button. Now on the Mac version, this import tab might be called the data tab. And if you click on files on the Mac version, I believe it has a drop down menu where you want to make sure that you're selecting Word files. For my part today, it just opens up a nice little window, and I've got 4 interviews. You will have more if you're grabbing them from the Dropbox server. And I want to select all of those interviews. You can use the little tick boxes, or you can hold down Shift or Control to select them. Select those interviews and click Open. Once I've done that, I get this final little reminder thing here. This option to create a case for each imported file is something that we'll probably have a look at a little bit later on today. Don't tick it for now, but hopefully by the end of class today, at the end of the workshop, you will see why this might be something that you could be interested in ticking, but it's going to be very context dependent on your own research projects. So once I've got that data selected, I click import, and NVivo is going to take some time to add those files. And once it has done so, we can see that our 4 files will show up here in this big central panel. And I don't really know what to call this kind of panel that we've got here. I think I've settled on calling it the selection panel. And that is going to be contrasted to, if I double click on an interview, the viewing panel, which is going to open up on the right-hand side here and show us our interview in NVivo. And we can scroll through it and we can read through it like that. Now, this general way of looking at NVivo is going to be where you spend most of your time. You've got our navigation on the left, our functions at the top, our selection just to the left here, and then a big viewing panel. And you can resize all of this stuff by trying to find the little double arrows, and you can drag things around. The very last thing that I'll show you before I hand this over and ask you to do it yourselves is when I opened up this document in NVivo, this interview transcript, I actually got a unique little button for my functions at the top here. And everything, as far as I can tell in NVivo, will have these options. It's context specific. And what it does is in this button, it will store all of the most useful functions and specific functions for whatever you have open. And so we can see that we could create a word cloud from this. We can turn on lots of different toggles and features just because we've got a document open. I do find this very useful, and they haven't got as much white space in these areas as they do in other areas. But that is as much as I'm going to demonstrate for this first little part today, creating a project, creating a folder, and putting interviews into that folder. I am now going to ask that you all have a go at doing this yourselves. And as you do so, I'll give you maybe 5 minutes to go through this. I'll eventually canvass you all for some thumbs up in the chat. I do understand a lot of you might have been following along as we went, but it's a really great opportunity for me to be able to read the chat and answer any questions. Maybe I need to go back into the software, but as I do that, please do feel free to get a start and work through these challenges here. Alrighty, so looking through the chat, yes, indeed, it is Poor UX Design. The Explore section is on the top toolbar of the Mac version. Very, very interesting. Loretta has asked, is there a capacity to enter data directly into NVivo without importing? I'm wanting to create a project that is totally dedicated to reflections. So I can analyze my reflections. Fantastic. Claire has said that there is a notes memos place where you can journal your process. I have to wait for me to see what it's called. So actually, the memos was something that I cut out of this session just because of time constraints. What I might very quickly do, because I can see that Shazia has asked to demonstrate the document tab again. I'll move back into NVivo, and the first thing that I'll do is I'll show off where the kind of, might think about journaling, where that might be stored, and then I'll go over the document tab and those things as well. So I'll go back into my project here. And so if you wanted to use NVivo as a research journal that you could then code, which is what I'll be using it for. I've got some digital ethnography planned, and I'm going to take field notes and then put them into NVivo or write them in NVivo and then code them and analyze them that way. There are a few options that we have available to us. You can use this notes section at the bottom here. And this notes section, if we click on this little arrow, will open up and we can select memos. And memos in NVivo, and I won't spend too long on this, but you can see the documents that you create to keep track or keep notes of any aspect of your project. And so what you can do is you can right click in the memos area, create a new memo, give it a name. We might think of, 26th August reflection. And what we can do is once we've created that, this is one of the things NVivo will open automatically. We can start writing, and you can use this. And once you've kind of done this, you can toggle off this edit button here. And once you've finished doing that, then you can subject this memo to the same type of coding that you would any file in NVivo. So that's, just a very brief kind of cursory examination of where you would write those types of notes. Alternatively, you can write them all in Microsoft Word or something like that, and then import them all into NVivo as well, depending on what works best. The only reason I bring that up is because writing in NVivo is not as smooth as it is in other word processors. So you may find more joy in doing it on a different piece of software and then putting it into NVivo, but you can certainly do it all in NVivo as well. To get to Shazia's question about seeing the document tab, the context-specific tabs will only open up if you have the file open. So you can see here when I'm not in an area, so even though I've got these things open on the right-hand side here, because I've left-clicked in this selection panel, nothing shows up. If I double-click on one of my interviews to open it, then on the right-hand side, the interview opens up and it automatically puts me into it. And so once that's opened, the document tab should show up there, with the one caveat that I don't think these context tabs will show up on the Mac version sometimes or all the time. So hopefully they do, but if they don't, that might be one of the issues there, but hopefully that all works. Again, if I sort of left click in the selection area, I lose the tab. If I left click back in, the tab opens back up again. So hopefully that's a good enough demonstration. So I'm just going to quickly check my timing here. I think it's been about 3-4 minutes or so. Very quickly, I'm going to canvas the group for some thumbs up. So if you feel relatively confident with this challenge as it's happened so far, feel free to drop a thumbs up in Zoom. If there's enough, I'll move on. If there's not, I'll give you some more time. So it's 3 thumbs up. I think I will give you a little bit more time to work through this first challenge. Carly said with the Mac version, I wasn't able to find the import tab, but it seems I can drop and drag. I think it might have been renamed to the data tab on the Mac version in the top. And on the Mac version as well, sometimes the functions will appear as like a top toolbar right at the top of your screen, even if NVivo is a smaller window. I think those are the options there. Alternatively, you could also, I think, right click on a file folder and you can import through there. Yeah. And you can see that Chris has said that went to the data tab, and then there's a document section that you can import from. Wonderful. Wonderful. Someone's dropped a thumbs up in the chat. Lots of people are as well. I will do a very quick canvas again, I suppose, then, of how people are going with this first challenge. And that's that sort of 3 ones there. There were 3 ones earlier. We'll see if there are any other ones. There's a few sort of coming up now as well. So what I might do then in that case, with people dropping them in, is I will move on to the next challenge. If you are struggling at all, of course, I'm free after the class and we can have a chat about it. But there'll also be a recording available, which will go over the demonstrations as they occur. So congratulations, everyone. We have made our first steps into NVivo. We have imported some files and we've created a project, a very useful first step, because what it helps us to do is to understand a lot of the key ways in which NVivo works as a piece of software. It's got that navigation section, the functions, the power of the right click, and then those 2 central viewing panes as well. And that's going to be really important because in the second bit of this part, before we get to our little tea break at 11, we are going to have a look at organizing our research data, and that's going to involve us having to understand the user interface a little bit more. Now, in this section, we're going to be looking at coding, cases, and case classifications. I've put the break in between cases and case classifications. We'll see how we go. And it may be earlier, it may be later, we'll see. But I find that once we've done the coding and the cases, things will start to get a little bit more complex in NVivo. Here's our glossary, and this is the glossary for both the codes and cases part of the session. Don't worry too much about the case stuff, because I do have what I think is a very neat visualization of how that's all going to end up looking a little bit later on. But for now, we need to kind of keep track of the 2 ways that NVivo talks about using codes. So we have coding, the verb, which is what you'd be most familiar with in qualitative research. It is that research process of taking bits of data and popping it into categories, the categories of which are going to be dependent upon your research project and your research question. In the latest version of NVivo, they also use the word code as a noun for a container which stores your coded information. However, if you are on previous versions of NVivo, particularly NVivo 12 on the Windows version, they will refer to these containers not as codes, but as nodes. And so it can be a little bit confusing. So confusing because I worked on NVivo 12 for a while that I will often use the two. I will not misuse them, but I will use them interchangeably, just as a byproduct of having experience with both of them. I have a feeling in other versions as well that codes might also be called themes, although I can't remember that. It might be on previous Mac versions. Cases are going to be individual units of observation in our research project. So for instance, if your project was concerned with people, an instance of a case could be Alex. And if you were working with universities, an instance of a case might be Swinburne University. It's going to be up to your research question, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. We've also got some attributes and some values, which we'll look at a little bit more later on as we go. Now, how exactly do we code in NVivo? This is a little bit tricky because there's sort of an epistemological question, I suppose, as well as a practical question. So the process of coding is facilitated in NVivo, but how we code overall is very context specific, and it's a really broad question. So for instance, you might have a coding framework that you develop well in advance of having access to your data, and you just apply your data to that code book once you've got your data. Similarly, you might have a survey, and you simply use your codes as ways of organizing different responses in the survey without necessarily having to do too much interpretative work. Conversely, you might have no code book in advance, go into your data and generate your coding framework directly from the data itself. There's no right answer, but what is important is that whatever you're going to do in NVivo, you have to justify it, and you have to leave a pretty good record of why you have done it. And so that's not something that NVivo necessarily tells you to do, but it is something that is going to be really important in your own research. It is not enough to say that you just imported data into NVivo and coded it. Just because the software is mentioned doesn't give you a free pass to be methodologically ambiguous. You need to go through and explain the steps that you took and the decisions that you made along the way throughout that coding process. So that's sort of something just to keep in the back of your mind when you are working with NVivo. Very, very important. So what does it look like? That's what I'm now going to show you, and it's going to kind of tie together a few of our skills that we have learned so far. Now, the first thing is that I've got my nice little save reminder. I like to click yes. And if you want to follow along, you can, but the steps are also in the slides. The important thing to make sure that we have is that we have open at least one interview. Now, whenever I open up anything in NVivo, it will store it with these tabs at the top here, so I can move between Barbara's interview and Charles's interview. I'm going to close the memo there as well. So I might just very quickly, in advance of working with codes, open up the 4 interviews that I have in NVivo, just so they're easily accessible. The reason I do that is because for the next part of the training, what we're going to be doing is moving away from our interviews folder into the codes folder. Now, if I select codes, you'll see that my data remains open on the right-hand side, but the selection panel in the middle changes. And that's going to be very, very useful to keep track of as we go. Now, creating codes when doing a demonstration is a little bit tricky just because my brain goes a bit haywire with managing everything. So I'm going to keep things very simple and just create a memorable quotes code. Very easy to put data into. Again, like with anything in NVivo, we are going to rely on our trusty right click. And if I right click on the code section, you can see I get all of these options. The most important one for the purposes of this challenge is the new code option. And that is going to allow me to create a container for information that I get from the interviews. Now, on the Mac version, it's not create a new code. It says create a top level code. That means the same thing. There's a reason why they call it top level, and I can touch on that in a little bit as well. So what I can do is I can give this code a name. I'm going to call it memorable quotes, and you can fill in a description. You can give it a nickname, and then we've got some extra options down here. Now, very similar to what top level code refers to, we also have this option to aggregate coding from children. And those of you might be thinking, what does that mean? Well, probably all are thinking, what does that mean? Because it's a bit confusing, but I'll make that clear in a little bit as well as we go. I just want to show off coding first, and then I'll talk about some of the extra options that we have available to us as we go through and do our coding. So I've got memorable quotes. I'm going to click OK, and it is going to create a little code for us over here. What we don't want to do, because this does happen every now and then, what we don't want to do is right click on our navigation tab and create a folder. A folder is not a code. A folder contains codes, but it does not contain any of this extra information. It's very important to keep in mind. We want to be working in this codes area, and we want to be creating codes here. All right, we want them to show up with this circle next to them to indicate that they are indeed a code and working in this area. Now, there are a few ways that we can code in NVivo. I'm going to show you the foolproof way, and then I'll show you a quicker way, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, depending on your device. So let's say, for the purposes of demonstration, that we are going to be first, we've decided that we're going to be coding entire paragraphs, right? That's a decision that we've made. You might make the decision to code sentences or even individual words. It's entirely up to you. But I'm going to code an entire paragraph. And to do that, I select all the text and I right click on it and I select code selection. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up this little menu here where I can, if I wanted to, create a new code, and I can code that selection to memorable quotes. Now, before I click on this blue button, just keep an eye on this left-hand side here, because it'll show us something very useful. It is going to show us in green that it has been coded to memorable quotes. And what we've done is we've taken this text and we've stored it in memorable quotes. Now, if I double click on our code, which is a container, if I double click on it, it will open that code up for us and we can see the data in it. Now, hopefully you can imagine that if you've done a whole research project, this will be very useful when writing your results, because you might sort your results by themes that you have identified within the text. And it's a really nice way of bringing up the quotes, but you can also see that at the top here, it's telling us which file the code is present in. It also gives us some numbers as well, 3.66% coverage. All that means is of all of the characters in an interview, this code here comprises 3.66% of the total set. One reference just means one instance of coding taking place. For instance, if I go back here and let's say I want to code this, I can select the text again, right click, code selection, memorable quotes, and we can now go back to our folder here and we can see we've now got two references for the two bits of text that I coded. That's a relatively slow but foolproof way of coding in NVivo. There is a quicker way of doing it, and that way is to select the text that you want to code, and that's going to involve you reading through it and making a decision about where it belongs. Importantly, your data can belong to multiple codes. It's a very useful feature, in fact, of NVivo, so don't worry about being exclusive here. Again, that's a decision you might make, but not necessarily a decision you have to make. And a quicker way is to select that text, hold down left click, and we can drag it into one of our codes. On the Windows version, we also get an extra bit of something very useful, which is that we can drag it into this blue area at the bottom here, and create a new code. So I could create a code natural environment, or actually just environment, and I can create that code right there. And then that's what you're going to be doing for the next challenges, to go through, read these interviews, select some text, and code them to different areas of your research project. I've got some of the sample codes that they use. They use things like fishing industry and natural environment and all of those kinds of things, but feel free to just go with it as you want and to back yourself as a researcher. They have tried to make these interviews relatively accessible in terms of how they operate, and that's what you'll be doing for the next few minutes or so. So I'll move back to my slide, and I can see that the chat's been going off, so I'll try and get to those questions there. And I will scroll through. So Chris can see nodes under codes on the Mac version. That is correct, and that's where it becomes very confusing, because codes is this kind of broad subset in previous versions of NVivo, whereas in later versions, they make codes mean a much more specific thing. So hopefully, if you are working with those versions, that you can use the node section and understand that that's similar to the code section. It is very confusing and very frustrating. Are those tabs not present on a Mac? I think I can only open one interview at a time on the Mac version. So depending on what Mac version you are on, your navigation won't be at the top level. It'll be, I think, in the bottom left corner is where you can move between different items that are open on your project. I believe that's where they stashed away on NVivo 12 for Mac. Should be somewhere there. Whereas on later versions, you've got those tabs at the top there that you can move between. Hopefully, yes, I can see that Damien's pointed out that it is in the bottom left-hand corner. Carly said she can only create a top-level node. That's the same thing. So I will, at the kind of end of this challenge, go through and talk about why they call some things top-level codes and top-level nodes. But yes, a top-level node is the same as what we just created. It's just got some extra terminology attached. Chris has said, is node the same as code on Mac? I don't have codes in my left-hand panel. Yes, it is the same on NVivo 12 on the Mac version. I can briefly canvass the very confusing history of why they changed terminology. It's not very interesting. It's just because they moved to the United States and lost a few of their kind of technical directors, and they used that as an opportunity to change their terminology, which confused everyone, in myself included. So yes, it will be nodes. There is a very old research paper written by Tom Richards, who is one of the original creators or engineers behind NVivo, where he tries to justify calling them nodes and not codes. And it doesn't make any sense to me at all why they made that original decision, but they did. And now we're kind of left picking up the pieces afterwards with all of the confusion that entails. But hopefully you're able to still work with the data, knowing that nodes are synonymous with codes in these later versions. All right, Carly has asked, can I create a subsection within the codes, bracket nodes? Yes, you can. And I think it's probably, hopefully everyone's got the instructions of the challenges down, because what I will now do is I will very quickly go back into NVivo, and before our break at 11 a.m., I will just show off a few extra features for code organization, because they're very important. So if I move back into my NVivo here, let's have a look at what we can do. So to create subsections within codes, we have a few options. The first is if I say created a code called, let's just say water quality. So I could have this code here for quality of water. And let's say I create that in advance and I then realize after a while of doing my research that this is probably better suited to being underneath the environment. What I can do is I can select that code and I can drag it underneath the environment. And you'll see I get a little plus button. On the Mac version, you get a little arrow. You can click on that little arrow or little plus button and open up what is now called a code hierarchy. Alternatively, we can just right click on the top code. So in this case, environment, and we can select new code. And we could have one for, say, the landscape, and we can click OK. Very, very useful. Creating hierarchies will help you organize your research data in lots of interesting ways. The other stuff that I want to show you was that little aggregate function from before. And to show that off, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to code some data into these, what are called child codes down here. Now pay attention to this number at the top here. So you can see in the environment, there is one file represented with two references. If I was to go and take this quote here and code that to water quality, you can see that the number of references for environment doesn't change. So I can go through, I can grab this, I can pop that in water quality as well, not going to affect the total number of references for the environment. Now, in some cases, that might be very useful if you're using it for certain purposes. But if you want to make broad comparisons between your top level codes, right, this being a top level code here, we can use what's called aggregation. And what aggregation does is it's a nice little automatic function. It'll take everything that's coded underneath the top level code and automatically code it to the top one. So to do that, what we can do is we can just select the top level one, right click. I'm just going to move my Zoom chat out of the way here. And we can select the aggregate coding from children option. Just keep an eye on the number of references at the top here. If I turn that on, it will increase the references up here to 4 because everything that's been coded underneath it is now coded to the top there. Chris has asked, what if a paragraph contains a reference to more than one code? Nothing. There's no awful consequence. It just means that when you bring up a response, when you bring up your code, it'll be in both places. There's no issue with coding two different codes to the same bit of text. It's a decision that you might make because you might want to do that. And you've asked, how do I code one paragraph that way? Very, very simple. All you need to do, so I've coded this paragraph to water quality. If I also wanted to code it to memorable quotes, I can just select the text and code it to memorable quotes. The references for water quality don't go down. It stays coded there, and it's now also been coded to memorable quotes. There's, hopefully that, very useful. And one of the things that we'll be kind of looking at later is how that all works. So those are a few little extra bits of how we can organize our coding there. What I am now going to do, I'll get to Andrew's question, and then we can have a short 5-minute break where you can keep going through the coding, but I'm going to grab some water afterwards. Andrew's asked, does NVivo show text that has been coded to multiple codes? And this is an interesting question. So yes, it does, in the sense that it will just have the text here, but how can we tell that it's been coded to multiple codes? Well, there are a few options. The easiest option is to go to our document tab that we've created at the top here, or if you're on the Mac version and you don't have this tab, to this 3 stripes pointing down, and or coding stripes at the top here. And we can left click on that and we can select all. You can change the parameters, but for the purposes of demonstration today, we're going to select all. And what that's going to open up on the right-hand side here it's going to show us where everything has been coded for. So we can see that this vertical strip refers to water quality. And we can see that this bit of text has been coded to water quality. And we can also see that it has been coded to memorable quotes, because we've got a strip there. And it's been coded to the environment because we did that aggregation. So using coding strips, you can see that something has been coded multiple times. And it's a good way to keep track of it. If you're wondering why the strips are all white, that's simply because we haven't selected a color for our codes. You can do that when you create a code, or you can change the color by right-clicking on the code, going down to this color option and assigning it a color. So I can give environment red, and you can see that our coding stripe for environment turns red, which can be a much nicer visual cue than a very thin white rectangle. So with those things out of the way, I'm glad Kylie thinks they're great. Well, actually, very quickly, I know I need to get water, but this is my favorite thing. It took them years to get this one cool function on NVivo, which is the coding stripes used to only be able to be read vertically. Latest version of NVivo, we can click this little button at the top here, and we can read them horizontally, which is great because it means I can read them, but then it expands them out so much that you have to use the scroll wheel to figure out where they belong to. It's a nice little function. I'm glad they added it after years of me complaining. So that's coding in NVivo. And that's where you're going to spend a lot of time. To be honest, you should be able to get the coding stripes on the Mac version. They are definitely there. I may need to have a think about where they might be. I might do that in my water break. I might quickly bring up my Mac version of NVivo and find where coding stripes are, because they definitely should be there. Damien's found them under the View tab. Fantastic. So I'm going to head off, and we'll take a 5-minute break. Feel free to keep going through the process of coding. Feel free to have an explore around. But when we get back for the second half of the class, we're going to be looking at cases, case classifications, and our visualization options. So I will see you back here at 11:08. Have a lovely break. All right, welcome back, everyone. I'll give you some minutes to get settled because it did just turn 11. I thought about having some fruit and I instead had a Tim Tam. So hopefully you've all treated yourself just as much because it's got that kind of vibe to it today. Melbourne, it's a pretty miserable day. So it feels like an appropriate day to slam some Timmies. So far, what we've had a look at are importing files, creating projects, and coding in NVivo. What we're now going to be having a look at are cases, case classifications, and queries and visualizations. And we'll see how we go for time. We may not get to spend a whole lot of time doing the bar chart at the end, but to be honest, I don't find NVivo's visualizations that good all the time anyway, so we will be all right in that regard. So the challenge that we're now going to be working on is on cases, but you might think, why even bother with them? What are they? So cases are very similar to your codes. The only difference is that your cases can be attached to a classification. And because they can be attached to a classification, it means they can do that little third function there. They can record and query demographic information. So you can link your interview participants to age groups, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, all of those kinds of things. Because you can do that, you can answer research questions really easily in a way that you can't using other pieces of software. It's one of the most powerful things that NVivo has to offer, but it does involve needing to set everything up in advance so that you can work with it. And if you can set it all up in advance, then you're going to be fine. You can fly through a research project. But also, cases are very useful because they can group multiple sources that relate to the same entity. So what they mean by that is if you've got an interview with Barbara, that's one file. Then you've got some follow-up email correspondence with Barbara, that's another file. And finally, a third interview with Barbara. You can relate all of those files together by coding them to the same case, Barbara. Conversely, if you have done a group interview or if you have a nice big survey file, then you can have lots of different participants, each as an individual case in one big file. So you could have 20 cases of survey respondents all in one file. Very, very useful. That final option there is what we're going to have a look at later today. We can visualize our project based on what are called attribute values. So what are attribute values? Don't worry. I think I've got them. I stashed them away. I've got my thing all mixed up. We'll look at attribute values later on. They're a little bit further down the track, but it's some of that terminology that's very useful for working with case classifications. For now, we're just going to be working with cases, and we're going to be following this workflow. So in the third challenge, what we're going to be doing is creating a case for the interview participants that we've imported, and we're going to be coding data into that case. This is just a refresher / reinforcement of what we have just done with our codes. Familiarizing ourselves with what is going to be one of the most common things you do in NVivo. Very nice skill to be able to have. Then in the fourth challenge, what we're going to be doing is creating a classification, which is kind of like a spreadsheet in NVivo. We're going to be creating some attributes for that classification to fill out the columns of that spreadsheet. We're going to tell NVivo that the cases we created in the third challenge belong to the classification. And then because we've done that, we can then fill in the values. Because what we've essentially set up is a spreadsheet we can fill in all of the gaps in. So I'm now going to show you very briefly how to create cases and how you code for them. So moving back into my version of NVivo here. Currently, we've been working in the code section. We now want to be working in the cases section. But it's really important that we press this little arrow over here and triple make sure that we are working in this cases section and not case classifications. Just something that can come up every now and then. So we want to left click on cases here. We can check that we're in the area because we chose it in the top left, but also because we get this description. And we want to close that. And very similar to what we did with our codes before, we can right click to create a new case. And I can call this one Margaret. And I can click OK. And we can just take everything that Margaret said and code it to Margaret's case, excluding what the interviewer said. That way we can make sure that when eventually the time comes to kind of check our data against itself, we're being accurate with what we are including. As a kind of big picture thing, what we can do with this data is we can kind of position our codes and our cases against themselves. So you would have seen before when we were looking at coding stripes, that's a very visual way of looking at the intersections between your codes, right? It will show you codes that have been used against the same bit of text. There's a systematic way to do that in NVivo using queries, and it makes it a lot easier to see those references. So we can, for instance, bring up all of the codes about the environment that Margaret specifically said, something we can look at doing later. But this process here, where I've created a case on the left-hand side, and I'm just dragging in Margaret's text, is very nice. Now, there are, quicker ways to do this. You'll recall that there was that big button we could press. Well, it's actually quite a little button we could press when we created or imported files into NVivo, and we could import them and create a case for each imported file. What that's going to do is that's going to select every bit of text in this file and code that to a case, which you probably don't want to do because it's going to include headings and question headings and bits that the interviewer said. So you'd probably have to spend a lot of time uncoding. However, if your file was a document written by a historical figure and you knew that everything in that document was related to them, then you could import it as a case. You could work with that. But for now, we're just going to be doing it manually. And you might be thinking, Alex, it's going to take ages going through this process. And I would say yes, but is that such a bad thing? In research, it's very easy to have to do a lot of really complicated tasks that require a rather great deal of thought, that require you to be a little bit stressed out as you do them and to use very specific methodologies. How many times in research are you going to have the opportunity to just select blocks of text and drag them over into containers? I find it very therapeutic. I hope you do as well. And that's what you're going to be doing for the next challenge. Working in the cases area, creating cases for your interview participants, and coding information into them. Again, you can see we're using coding in the verb sense here, not necessarily in the container sense. And this is where the distinction between the two versions of NVivo become a little bit more frustrating, because in the previous versions, codes is a catch-all term for everything in your research project. That is going to be underneath here. So this would be called codes, and that would contain your nodes and your cases. Whereas in the later version, we've got this coding area, which contains our codes, but we are also coding into our cases. Very confusing, but hopefully with practice, you will kind of get your heads around how this is all going to be working and how it's all set up. So I'll move back to my slide deck here and ask that you rinse and repeat and go through that process, creating cases much in the same way that you would create codes, and moving your information into those codes, into those cases. I'm getting confused. Very similar to codes, you can also double click on a case to open up all of the responses there as well, so you can see all of that information. Now I'm going to quickly go through the questions here. Can you have top level cases? Yes, you can. I see that a few people have asked that question. Can you have top level and child cases and all of these things? Yes, you can. You can have hierarchies of cases. You very, very often will see those used in institutional analyses. So for instance, at the University of Melbourne, you could have one case for the University of Melbourne. You could have a case underneath that for the Faculty of Arts, Faculty of Science, and you could have use that as a way of doing your cases and managing those hierarchies there at an institutional level. I see that Chris may have been having some issues dragging across data as I am doing it. On the Mac version, you can't drag data across and create a new code or a new case. So you have to have those containers ready in advance. But also, this is just, might not have happened to you, but it has happened to me a lot. If you're working on a trackpad or even with a mouse, to be honest, it can be really different in terms of not different, but difficult in terms of registering the text. Buying a mouse is very useful in NVivo. I used to have one, and then I lost it. So you can see you've created cases in the top panel. Rather than right click, you want to drag it over. It could just be a temperamental thing with your computer, to be honest. That's why I show off the right click one. Damien's got some tips there that you may need to hold down the mouse for a little bit longer to toggle the drag function on. That's very useful. Hopefully that works. But if it doesn't, then you might be stuck with right clicking until you have a mouse available. There was a question as well. This is a very important question from Andrew, which is, Alex, how are cases and codes different? For example, haven't we just coded Margaret as a case the same way it would be coded? And the answer is yes, we have. Why have we bothered using the cases area? Now that's going to become a little bit clearer in the next challenge, but by coding Margaret as a case and not as a code, we can attach demographic information to Margaret. You can't attach demographic information to a normal code in NVivo. You can't tell NVivo that Margaret, if she were a code, belongs to an age group between 25 and 34. You just can't do that. It's not a function that it has available to it. And so by coding Margaret to a case, we can attach that case to a classification, which we can't do with normal codes. And that classification can store a whole bunch of extra information. Now, we do the coding step first because I think it makes a little bit, it's maybe more of a gentle introduction to cases and classifications than getting started with the classification. But in previous trainings, I would start with the classification to make it very clear from the get-go that you are going to be working in a different area and you're going to have a lot of extra information available to you by working in this zone. Janice has said that, what if I accidentally drag into the wrong case? Is it easy to rectify? Don't worry, you haven't done it. So this is where the undo button becomes very useful. So in NVivo, and I'll show this off in the next challenge or the next demonstration as well, there is an undo button, but there's also an uncode button as well. And I'll show those both off before I move into the next section as well. But how are people going so far with creating cases? Get some thumbs up if you're feeling confident with them so far, or if you need a little bit more time. Let's have a little flick through here. No thumbs up so far, so I will give you plenty more time. What I'll do is I will quickly show off uncoding and all of that stuff as well that we just spoke about. So move back into my file here. What we have is in the top right, you have the undo button, and you can undo up to 5 of your most recent actions in NVivo. So if you accidentally code something, immediately you can press the undo button and it will reverse that. So I think the last thing that I did was I coded to Dorothy. Let's suppose that that was a mistake. If I click undo, it'll show me the 5 most recent actions. Unfortunately, they're not very specific. So I kind of don't even really know which is the first one, which is the last one. But let's just take a bet and we'll undo this action here, assuming that's the first action or the last action that we took. And we can undo that there. However, let's say that you code something improperly and go and do a whole bunch of other stuff, and you want to undo that change. Well, there's a few ways we can go about doing that. The easiest way, if you've made a coding mistake, is to open up the code. So we can open up Margaret here, for instance, and select the piece of text that we want to uncode So let's just say it's this last reference here. I can select all of that. And then at the top, I've got this uncode option. I can also right click and select uncode, and that will also give me the much more specific option of being able to uncode from this case. So very, very useful to have. So I can left click there and I can uncode that way. Those are probably the two methods that I would recommend for uncoding. See, Helen's dropped a thumb into the chat there. I was gonna, it's not 25 past, so I'll do another little quick check-in. How are folks going with this challenge, creating cases and moving data into them? Seeing a few more thumbs up this time, which is always a good sign. And I will, not that I'm being too democratic about it, I'm not waiting for a majority, just a good indicator, because I obviously understand a lot of you might be on Zoom on one device and then using NVivo on another. Let's move on towards case classifications. And maybe I was a slight tad bit over ambitious with the amount of content that I put in today. I think we should still be able to go through case classifications and queries, just being increasingly less likely that we'll be able to work with visualizations. This is where I thought the break would be. You must obey, 5-minute break. It's all in capitals. I found that very humorous when I was designing my slides last night. So case classifications, what do they look like? So this is the end goal that we are creating. And you might remember some of these glossary terms from before. So the case classification is this whole spreadsheet. On the left-hand side, in each row, we have an individual cases, and that's what we just created. So we created Barbara as a case. You might have created Charles as a case. Probably didn't create Alex as a case. And he's in the 20 to 29 age group, not the 20 to 19 age group. And so you will then have at the top here what are known as attributes, right? So these are broad categories. And I've got two kind of generic ones, right? So age group and occupation. You might use them for a wide range of different cases, but they were really interested in this research project of the total generations that this person had been in the region for. Were they someone who had recently moved to the region and so had no roots there, had some, maybe their parents lived in the Down East region, or their family has been there their whole kind of ancestry thing for at least 5 generations. And so that's where you can think about attributes as a much more specific way of answering your research questions, if it's going to be important to you to be able to look up different bits of data. But all of this information in the middle here is going to be what we call values, and that's going to match the case with the attribute. So Alex, his occupation in his spare time when he's not teaching, he's running great Swedish 80s Stranger Things adventures, or he's running his players through some awful dungeons that he's designed in fever dreams as he tries to get to sleep. And those values are going to be very useful. Now, one of the things that you might think of is how useful are all of these going to be? So there's a few different ways of using them, right? So for occupations, it's going to be very unlikely that people have the same occupation for some research projects. In fact, it might be one of the aims of representative data in your research project that everyone has a different occupation. If, however, you were doing a research study between two groups, you might have professional staff members at a university and academic staff members, then having occupations where you could categorize the two would be very useful. You see here for age group, we've got these broad ranges as well, and that's going to help us have values that are going to be much more, they're going to have more in common. So there'll be more people, we might have 5 participants who are in the age group of 30 to 39, whereas if we just went with their individual ages, it's very unlikely that we would have much overlap. And so depending on your research project, where you get your overlap from is going to be very relevant and relative to your research question. But you've got to think in ways in which you can group those attributes together, those values together, so that you can have something of a group of data. So let's see how that all works. It is confusing. Case classifications are tricky and they're not necessarily deployed in the right way always in NVivo. But let's have a look at how that's going to work. So we've been working in the cases section. We now want to really make sure we're working in the case classifications section, not the cases section. I'm going to close this. And what I can do is I can right click and create a new classification. Now, a lot of research projects will have a spreadsheet which has all of their participants' information on it. Maybe it's been de-identified or anonymized, or it's something you've just been whipping up as you go through with your research project. If that is you, and that's a very common case, you can import a classification sheet. It's a little bit temperamental and it does require lots of finicky adjustments. So we don't cover it today, but you can have a look at it in your own time if your participant data is already stored on a spreadsheet, or if you want to do it on a spreadsheet in advance and then import it into NVivo, you can do that as well. So I'm going to click New Classification, and on the Windows version, we can actually have things made really easy for us. We can just add a predefined classification to our project. In this case, we would be adding the person classification. But on the Mac version, that option isn't there. So we are going to create our classification from the ground up. So again, we can give it a name, we can give it a description, and we can click OK. Now, if we were to double click on this classification that we've just created, you might see the vague suggestion of what could be the spreadsheet that we're building. It is a single cell in the top left corner. What we need to do is 2 things. We need to add cases to the left-hand column, and we need to add attributes to the top row. To add attributes, we've got a few options. We can use this context specific button that's opened at the top here to add our attributes, or we can right click on the classification and select new attribute. And I believe you can right click on this area in the middle here. And no, unfortunately, you can't add them that way. I think on the Mac version, there's a way of adding attributes by right clicking on the spreadsheet that you've created. And so we can right click on the classification over here and create a new attribute. And just to keep things simple, the first attribute I'm going to create is occupation. And that is going to I'm just going to create that and leave it as it is, because everyone's occupation is probably going to be different and it's important information to keep track of. On the Mac version, you'll notice that you have underneath this kind of general window here, you'll have some extra options below. But don't worry about them for now, because we're just going to leave this attribute as it is and click OK. And what's going to happen is that is going to show up on the top row. Congratulations, we've created an attribute in NVivo. But let's say that you want to have age ranges, but you would also be aware that sometimes data entry is a thankless task and you will make a mistake. Well, what we need to do, and what we can do, is we can create a list of values in advance so that when we comes time to input our data, we have a limited set that we can select from, so we're being consistent. And so we're going to reduce the room for error. To do that, we can right click, new attribute. And this time, I'm going to go with age group. And I'm going to navigate over to the values tab. Now on the Mac version, this is that extra area that's underneath here. And on your version, on the Mac version, you'll see this big plus button. You can click that plus button to add a potential value. They always have unassigned and not applicable by default, but we can start to add our own values here. So we go 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and 35 to 44. And we can select those and we can click OK. And that's going to create one there for us as well. No way of checking, but we are filling in this top row. You might also want to add the generations down east attribute that they add in the research project. And again, we can input some potential values 0, 1, 2, 3 plus, for instance. I can click OK there as well. And we've created a set of attributes. So we're filling in that top row of our classification sheet. The next step is to now fill in the left column, telling NVivo that the cases we created before belong to this classification sheet. And the easiest way to do that is to go back to our cases section, to left click on a case, or to right click on a case, and right at the bottom of this drop down menu, we've got a little classification option, and we can tell NVivo that this classification that Dorothy belongs to is people. And once we've done that, we can see that Dorothy appears here, and we can fill in this information. You don't have the ability to do this with standard cases. So again, you can go down to Margaret. I can assign Margaret to people as well. I think the other interviews that I have are from Charles and Barbara. So I can create a new case for Barbara. And if you're creating a new case and you've got a classification already set up, what you can do is when you're creating a new case, you can see we've got this little tab at the top here that says attribute values. I can left click on that and I can assign them in advance to the classification sheet there. And I can do the same with Charles. Again, just going over that, creating the case, creating a new case, using this attribute values tab over here and assigning them to the classification that we've created. Once I've done that, I can then go through and start to assign the age ranges using this drop down menu here. On the Mac version, it is going to be I think it's a magnifying glass is the option to assign those predetermined values. Now, for the cases, for the purposes of the class today, you can just make this up. But what's going to be important later on is that you have at least 2 people belonging to these categories. It's going to make things a lot easier as we go. So we can go and assign, 2 generations there, and we can go with 3 plus here as well. It's just going to make things a little bit easier when we develop our framework matrix in the next step. Finally, if we wanted to input something manually, we can left click on something to select it to make it go blue, and then left click again on the text. And hopefully, I have to double click, sorry. If you select a cell and double click on it, you can input text yourself. So we can go through and we can input their occupations and go through and have those all filled in. And we can pop those in there ourselves. Importantly, if I was then to select this little drop-down menu, as soon as you put a value in for the first time, it will save it and you can use it as a drop-down option there as well. So that's case classifications. A little tricky. There's a few steps involved, so I'll just briefly go over them again before we go and I get you to do it yourselves. We're in the case classifications area. We create a new classification. In that classification, we then create attributes. And once we've done that, we open up the sheet. We tell NVivo that the cases we had created in the previous challenge belong to this classification. And once we've done that, we can then fill in the values on the classification sheet. Now, on the Mac version, I'll just very briefly touch on this. I think the Mac version has two different sort of like windows you can move between, one of which only shows you the attributes and another which will show you the sheet. I believe it's like a tab that's in about this area of the screen, but I'm not too sure. It's just something to be aware of if you're on that version. But I'll move back to my slide deck. I'll give you plenty of time to go through this and to work with it. If you have any questions at all, please do ask. And I'll quickly go through the chat and see if there's anything too pressing there. So Claire's said that, yes, on Mac, you can create some cases and right-click on these things, and Loretta loves this feature. Me too. Very, very useful for a whole range of research projects. I will say that I get a lot of emails, naturally, about using NVivo at UniMelb. Using case classifications is usually the answer to most of the emails that I get, or it is at least an answer, or it's a step on the way to giving them the right answer that they need. A lot of people with NVivo have the desire to be able to show off different things and compare different attributes and things like that. So very, very useful. Some people's minds are swimming with classifications. They need to map them out. And Chris is a bit lost after setting up the age group. That's okay. I will go through and do that. Again, it does take a fair amount of time to go through as well. It is a bit of a process. I will very quickly go back to sharing my screen here and just to kind of go over the processes. It will look different on the Mac, so there's no need to go over it, but it is confusing anyway. So once you've created your classification, you will have in the details panel, as Claire has mentioned at the top there, the option to open a classification sheet. Nice to have that up. But the next step for you, Chris, once you've created your attributes, is to go to the cases section and right-click on a case that you created in the previous challenge, navigate down to this classification option and assign it to the classification that you just created. And once you've done that, then this sheet will open up and you can fill in the values. Brilliant. Hopefully that helps. But yes, it is a little tricky. And it also, I think, doesn't help that we don't have a huge understanding of this research project as members of a training class to be able to kind of get a lot of the decisions. I mean, I think that the main thing that I'd recommend is, you need to map these out for your own research projects well in advance. You need to think what categories are going to be important for you to be able to work with and to address. It's just a nice kind of thing to take away and to think about. So on the Mac version, your age group ranges might not be showing up. So if you click on the little magnifying glass, they should show up. If they don't, you may need to double click and sort of like start typing them, and they might show up there as well. That might be an option. If they're not doing that in the age group range section of your classification sheet, something may have gone a little wrong, but the magnifying glass worked fantastic. That helps make things a lot easier. Back to my slide deck. And I'll give you some more time for this one. It can take quite a bit of time to get through. Alrighty, so we've got a couple of questions here. I'll actually get to Nicholas's first because it is going to be something that we have a look at in the next part. You're right to assume that the classification can help us fine-tune specific queries. For example, looking at people ages 20 to 29 who were also coded to the phishing code. The answer is yes, and that is the #1 reason why we use case classifications. It really helps answer those specific questions, and that's what we're going to have a look at in a little bit. Going up from there, we have there was someone forgotten to the first step for creating attributes. No worries. So if we go back to our training file here, we've got we're in the cases section at the moment. We want to make sure we're actually in the case classification section. And to create an attribute, once we've created a classification, which is the briefcase one, we can right click on that classification and we've got the new attribute option, and they'll show up as the 4 squares down there as well. And that's what will help delineate them. Still quite poor UX design, but that's how you go through and create those there. Laura said she used this feature for the literature review. Took ages to set up, but then when it's all accurate, it's fantastic when analyzing data. I actually might take this moment here to touch on some of the lit review stuff in NVivo. I've been kind of looking for an opportunity. I haven't necessarily been able to find one because we've been going through it all. So as you're working on case classifications, I'm just going to wax lyrical about doing literature reviews in NVivo. So it's very similar to doing any research project, but there's a few differences. The main one is that you're probably going to end up importing your reference library from Zotero or another reference manager. If you do decide to use that, the option to keep in mind, or the thing that you really need to remember, is that you've got 5 options, but for each option, there is a very specific file type that they're asking for. And that's not always going to be obvious because Zotero and EndNote, I know, can export their libraries as dozens of different file types. So for Zotero, you need to make sure that you're using the RIS format, for instance. The RIS format is the one that's going to help keep all of your attachments in NVivo, whereas the .text will just be the reference data with none of the attachments. So when you import something like a reference library into NVivo, the attachments will become their own files, and you can open up, say, a PDF of a journal article, and you can go through and you can code that. However, there are some problems there. The main problem is that unless you are very, very rigorous, unlike me, a lot of your references in Zotero won't have attachments. They might be references for books that are stashed away behind a paywall, or physical books that you've got and taken out from the library in that magical make-believe time when we could all leave places and go to libraries. That data isn't going to be attached. There will still be a reference for it, but the actual file itself won't be there. And that's a problem, because that means if you go through your attachments and you code them, you're not coding things that aren't attachments. And so when the time comes to write up your literature review, you're either going to have your data in 2 places, or you're going to have half your data in one place, and you're not going to have access to any thematic stuff that you've done with references that aren't stored in NVivo. So the key recommendation that I've received over the years from a bunch of other NVivo trainers, the wise other teachers of NVivo who are out there in the wild, is that you create, instead of a necessarily directly coding your attachments, what you instead do is for every reference, you create a memo, just as we did for this reflection earlier on. So we're working in the memo section again, not something we really covered in much detail today, but hopefully it's a good starting point. And as a memo, you write your notes, quotes, reflections, whatever on the literature, and you link it using this memo link button at the top left there, which I think we need to have the edit button possibly turned on, or there's a little bit of a tricky way of doing it. Don't worry too much about it. You can kind of look it up online, but we can link this document directly to the reference, so that whenever we open up the reference, we can also open up this notes page on it. And what we do is we use these notes for all of our references, whether they have attachments or not, and we then code our notes. And that way, we are consistently looking at every aspect of the literature, not just the ones we have attachments for. Makes it a lot easier to centralize, and it means you can be a lot more consistent, but also you're writing quite a lot more as you go through it as well. That's the literature reviews. It's a bit of a tangent. If you're busy, hard at work doing case classifications, then don't worry. This will show up on the recording as well, and you can have a look at it there. But I just wanted to touch on those because I know a few people have been asking in the chat, and I've been kind of looking for an opportunity to do them. So I hope that that makes sense to other people. I've got a few questions here as well. We can't create the same attributes across two different classifications, but in Damien's research project, you'll have people and texts, and you want to be able to note the network they are associated with. Is it possible to have the same attribute used across multiple classifications? Unfortunately not. That's a very interesting case study of what the limitations of this might be. What you instead might want to do, because there's nothing wrong with having a classification sheet that has, kind of a double use to it, right? You could have one attribute that says, is it a person or is it Netflix, for instance? And that could help you set what other attributes you respond to. So you could have attributes in your classification that just apply to people and attributes that just apply to Netflix. And that way you'd be able to store them all in the same place. It's a bit of a workaround, but hopefully that works. Chris has asked, do you mean that if you have annotated attachments in Zotero, they won't come across? Also, what if you have tagged your references in Zotero? Will those tags come across? Actually, not too sure. I believe the annotated attachments don't come across. I don't think NVivo can take the annotations in Zotero and pop them in. I don't believe that's something that it has the ability to do, just because I think the annotations in Zotero are stored a little bit differently. In terms of tagging, I believe that will come across. I believe that all of the tags in Zotero do get translated into NVivo. And then Clara said, are you saying all of the highlights from the PDF I would put in the memo? Not in terms of highlights, I guess, you could, I would essentially be treating the memo as the document that you're going to be coding. So if you want to have any highlighted text there, make sure that that's in the memo, and that's how it'll work. But again, it's not something I have a huge degree of experience with. I've given it a go a few times. I think, like I mentioned last week, I'm much more sympathetic to using pen and paper just because I'm on my computer so often anyway. But there are some resources that I can share as well from the last slide deck, which have more experienced people talking about literature reviews in NVivo. But anyway, we've got 10 minutes left, or give or take. How are people going with case classifications? Are there some thumbs up that I can access, and we can move on to what will be the final part of the class today? One thumbs up. Might give you a little bit more time. There are some thumbs ups coming in the chat as well, possibly. Loretta, while people chuck some thumbs up in, Loretta is doing multiple case studies that they want to code, wants to classify similar stakeholder types in each. What is your advice about how I set this up as a hierarchy in cases? Not too sure without knowing more about the research project that you're working with. My advice is always, if the less cases you can create, probably the better, because you want to make sure that you have enough data to be able to answer the questions. If you're classifying stakeholder types, I would make sure that that's an attribute. That'll work a lot easier. And then the classification might just be stakeholders, for instance. It's a tricky one without knowing much about it. Hopefully that's something that, maybe at the end of the class today, we can have a chat about that and might be able to give you a bit more information, but without knowing too much more, it's difficult to provide an answer. And Claire's provided some advice for Damien as well, which is fantastic. So the last part of today. I'm sorry that we won't get to the visualizations, but I've got to be completely honest. I don't think they're great in NVivo. I sometimes feel contractually obligated to show them off. I think the queries are going to be much better. What are queries? They are a set of functions in NVivo, which will allow you to ask questions of your research data. So there are some general functions like word frequency and text search, which are very nice. But then we also have things like coding comparisons. We've got group queries. And my advice would be to experiment with them in your own time. The one we're going to be focusing on today is the framework matrix, which is my favorite. And it's going to show off kind of what we have all been working towards the end of class today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on over into my NVivo, which will be most likely for the last time today. And we want to make sure we're working in the Explore tab at the top here. This is where the queries are all stored. Now, we also have, for purposes that'll be, something that you can look up in your own time. This is what we were going to be doing for the last challenge. You can use this chart button here to create a bar chart for your project. And you can also right-click on anything in NVivo, say an interview, and you can select the visualize option and create a chart for that as well. That's something I'll let you do in your own time. For this last bit of work that we'll be doing, we want to be using this matrix coding query, which in previous versions might be called framework matrices. And we're going to left click on it. And it is going to open up a kind of parameters panel in the top right here. And it's very, very useful for helping you to find patterns in your data. Now, these parameters are something that you're going to become familiar with just in general. With NVivo, there's a lot of different options that you can select from. This first thing, by default, NVivo will look at all of your files. So it'll look at all of these interviews. If you had any literature, it would look at all of those. If you had anything stored in the external section, it would look at those as well. Because we've only imported those interviews today, we can simply leave it as files and externals. But in other cases, you might need to specify the data that you want to look at. Then we can say what we want to have in our rows. So what we can do is we can say, select all of the codes that we've created today, which for our purposes will just be environment and memorable quotes. And what I might do is I might also drag in, just for the sake of kind of showing off how big the framework matrices can get, I'll drag in water quality as well, but we haven't coded anything to landscape. Then in the columns, what I can do is I can go to my case classification. And it's been a while since I've tried out this one in particular, but I believe this does work. We can drag in, no, we can't drag it in. That's right. What we instead need to do for the columns section here, is where it gets a little bit different, is we can click on the plus button to add items. And that'll bring down a little drop-down menu where we can select attribute values. We can select again, and we can go to our case classifications, go down to people and select age group, for instance. And we can go equals value 18 to 24. We can click OK. Then what we need to do for this one is we need to go through and we need to select all of the attributes that we're interested in having a look at. So we can select age group again, and we can go down to 25 to 34. And finally, we can go attribute values. We can go down to age group again and add the final one. Now, you might be thinking, geez, Alex, this is a really bloody time-consuming process. And the answer is yes, it is. The problem is that there's another function, and there's another query in NVivo, which will do this attributes automatically. It's called a cross table, but it looks so different on the Mac and Windows versions that I just can't teach it in the minutes that we have. And so I'm just going through and adding these attributes manually. You can look at cross tabulation and cross tables in your own time. So what I've got is in my rows, I've got our codes, and in the columns, I've got those attributes that we created earlier in the class today. And I'm going to then finally click run query. And it's not going to look super impressive because there's not going to be a whole lot of data here. There may only be a little bit of data because I've only coded for 2 files. You might have more because you've done more coding during the class today. But I hope that you can see how useful this would be, because it shows you where all of the data is. But most importantly, here's the final trick, the reveal. If I double click on any of these cells, it will show me the data straight away. Or by straight away, I mean after a slightly considerable bit of time loading, it will show me all of the data that is coded for, if we go back to our matrix query on the left-hand side here, all of the data that is coded to the environment between people's aged 35 and 44. Incredibly useful. This is the #1 result that people need in NVivo. It's the #1 question I get asked about, and this is always the solution, working with framework matrices. They don't all have to be attribute values. You can, for instance, have a code and another code. So you can put codes on the left-hand side, codes on the right-hand side. There's loads of different options, but it's a really easy way and an accessible way of being able to engage with your data. You could imagine having this open, bringing these cells up, these references up, and writing research reports. Now, I know, unfortunately, we are at time today. So Nicholas has said that by going just to the adding items button, they were able to add all of the attributes. Fantastic. That's a much quicker way of doing it. And you have indeed sparked my memory. I knew there was a quicker way of doing it than what I was doing. You can use the add items button to go through and do that as well and add all of the attributes without needing to go through them manually. But while you kind of all work away on that, because it is close to 12 p.m., I will say thank you all so much for a lovely workshop. I am sorry that I was a little overly ambitious with some of the content today, but I can safely say that if you can create this framework matrix, then you're understanding all of the things that we've done so far in the training, and you will be able to go and do a farm to table research project in NVivo. I will leave my email address in the chat as well. If you need to get in touch with me, I'm fine with that. I love being able to respond to emails. Chris has asked if there are any easy guides moving forward that we can refer to. And unfortunately, there isn't. A lot of the extra guides for NVivo are hidden away behind paywalls nowadays. The only one that I've been able to find, which is not necessarily an advanced guide, but which is maybe a slightly more useful guide, is from NVivo themselves. And I'll very quickly grab that link. Carolyn, if you wanted to put in any closing remarks in as well, I'll go and look that up really quickly.
No worries. Just to say thank you. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Thank you everyone for all the questions. And I think we're all inspired to go off and experiment some more with NVivo. So that's terrific. Thank you. Does anyone, if anyone needs the sign-in sheet, I will pop it up again for everyone now. And there we go. Sorry, Alex has put their link up there. Yeah, no worries.
Yes. And they do have community forums for NVivo as well, which can be very useful for troubleshooting. I'll link those as well. They've brought them up again recently. There you go.
Terrific. Excellent. Wonderful. Round of applause for the amazing Alex. Terrific. Thank you so much. Yep. Davey's got a hand up. According to my screen, sorry, I haven't got the whole gallery on. There we go.
Could be rapturous applause, but
yeah, it probably is.
Happy to answer questions as well.
There you go. International Dog Day as well. Thanks for that extra bit of information, Damien, by the way. Terrific. Excellent. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. And yes, do let us know if you have any follow-up questions and we can tackle those. Great dog image there. My dog has a lot longer fur than that, but very, very cool. But about the same length of snout, I have to say, especially when she's grumpy. Cool. All right. Okay. We'll end the session there. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Have a lovely day, everyone. And I hope you're able to find some joy with NVivo.
We will. We will. Thank you.
I can see that, Greg, you've quickly unmuted yourself. Do you have any questions before we head on off? No? All good? Wonderful.
Cool.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I'll head off as well then.
Excellent. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Have a lovely
See ya.
week.
Thanks.